Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to attend my opening talk this morning. And I'm really pleased to be here. It's my second time in Berlin, and it's a very beautiful city. This is one of the only conferences I ever attended which is primarily women as well. So the side advantage to that is that I'm surrounded by people in amazing outfits, and I want to go shopping afterwards and find out where you got your shoes and your dresses. So it's actually kind of very different from what I normally do. So my background is I'm an aerospace engineer. All my degrees are in aerospace engineering. I spent the majority of my career working for the space program for NASA, about 17 years in total, and then I worked for Boeing for 3 years when I was right out of school. And then I decided to join the private sector about 2 years ago. And what I think is interesting about sort of the trajectory of my career is that ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to be involved in the space program. So I was hugely motivated by science fiction, primarily Star Trek as opposed to Star Wars, but I love to read a lot of science fiction. And so being able to work for NASA, become an aerospace engineer was kind of a dream for me. I had the opportunity to work on the development of propulsion systems to send things into deep space to the main asteroid belt, to work on the system that landed the Curiosity rover on Mars, and then work on a experiment that went to the International Space Station in 2018. But the more time I spent working as an engineer, the more I felt like I wasn't doing enough to contribute to society, to actually sort of make the world a better place, to make the planet a better place. And so I wanted to find a way that I could take my engineering skills and my leadership skills and put it to good use. And so I decided to leave the government sector and go into the private sector and start working on the development of new types of transportation systems, specifically ones that are green or sustainable, so that we can do something to reduce our carbon footprint on the planet. And so the reason why this ties in really nicely with the space program is that in this image you can see the 3 terrestrial planets. The planet in the middle, of course, is Earth, which is our home. The planet on the left-hand side is Venus, which is one planet in from us. It has a surface temperature of about 475 degrees centigrade and a surface pressure 100 times the surface pressure here on Earth. The planet on the right is one planet out from us, Mars, and it has a surface temperature of about minus 50 to 70 degrees centigrade and a surface pressure 1% of what we have here on Earth. And the reason why this is important is because at the beginning, the formation of our solar system, these planets were actually very similar to each other. So what we can see is that climate change is actually a planetary phenomenon, and we can observe it by looking at our own neighboring planets, which is terrestrial planets. So whatever we can do as a society, as a community, as leaders, as engineers, as scientists, to be able to reduce our carbon footprint is a way that we can protect our planet for the next generations to come. And so the way I do that is by being an engineer. And one of my favorite quotes is from the sort of father of modern aerodynamics, Theodor von Karman, which is that engineering is basically using the tools of science and mathematics to create new technologies to be able to hopefully make the world a place that is much better for the people that come next. So you can use technology for good. And so that historically is how engineering has been implemented over the course of the ages. But what is interesting, though, is that sometimes when you try and do something which is very difficult, very complicated, very out of the box, you're going to face a lot of opposition in your lives and your careers. And a great example of this is the Wright brothers. So just before the Wright brothers demonstrated their first lifting body aerodynamic flight, there was a very famous British physicist who said that was impossible. The only way you could fly is basically when you're doing things which are lighter than air, such as helium balloons. And only a few decades later, the Wright brothers proved him wrong. And aerodynamics and flight using lifting body aerodynamics essentially has connected the world in a way that we've never seen before. And this also ties back really nicely to science fiction. Because if you are a science fiction fan, you'll know that things like the Motorola flip phone was first invented in Star Trek, or the tablets and the iPads that we use today were actually invented in Star Trek Next Generation. So there's so many examples of how science fiction has served as a source of imagination for people to create these new technologies. And so I think that's really exciting, because what that means is that as individuals, we can actually create the future that we imagine. And if we imagine it to be a better place, a kinder place, a cleaner place, a greener place, we can make that happen with the tools that we have been given, which is our minds and our imagination. And I think where that couples nicely to transportation is that if you take a look at the way human society has evolved over the course of the past 5,000 years or so, transportation technologies have revolutionized our society. You go back to 3000 BC, when the wheel was invented. Imagine how that changed the way villages were able to transport goods and services between neighboring villages. Move forward a couple of thousand years, the development of The Industrial Revolution was essentially facilitated by the development of the railway network, once again being able to move goods and services over large distances very efficiently. Move forward a couple of decades further, the internal combustion engine facilitated the development of cars, and those cars enabled city expansion, personal mobility, a level of freedom which had never really been imagined before. Move forward a few more decades, and the development of aircraft, and specifically jet aircraft, which have enabled global connections, global commerce, which has connected our world in ways which I think people from a couple of thousand years ago would never have imagined possible. So transportation technologies truly have revolutionized our societies, and coupled to that is tremendous economic growth, right? Think of all the new disruptive technologies that have come about as a result, and then all the jobs and the ways that society and humans can profit and benefit from that. But what we also know is that transportation networks lead to waste. I live in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is one of the most congested cities in the United States, perhaps one of the most congested cities in the world. And our daily lives are essentially, limited and revolve around our commute. So transportation networks can lead to a lot of waste. Waste in terms of our time. The congestion also leads to additional pollution on the roads, in the airs, so it's actually a health hazard for society. And so we need to come up with ways to solve this problem. Now, if you look at it from a business perspective, when you have delays sort of at the ports, on the highways, in the airports, when goods are sitting and not being able to get transported from point A to point B, that actually has a cost as well on the economy. So we need to come up with something to solve this, because the current methods are essentially unsustainable. And what has been done for the past 100 or so years has been more of the same. Bigger airports, additional runways, more highways, which is what you see in California, specifically Southern California, bigger ports. Those things don't actually help to solve the congestion problem. And in fact, they actually make it worse. So what do? You apply a systems engineering mindset. You try and reinvent transportation by thinking about the things which drive our need for an improvement in transportation. And those things can be thought about in a very systematic way. Of course, to reduce time, you would want to be able to have a faster mode of transport, so you reduce the overall travel time. If you are an end-use customer, you want to have a positive passenger experience. If you are trying to sort of scale a system up, you want to be able to handle the capacity which is needed to transport people from point A to point B, transport goods from point A to point B. Any new transportation system has to be safe, right? Otherwise, you're not going to implement it. It would be terrible if you had a system which was less safe. And any system which is implemented has to be cost-effective, both for the government customer who puts it into place, as well as the end user who will go and buy a ticket and ride on this transportation system. And I think one of the most important things, and I think has been a theme of the conference over the past day and a half, is environmental impact. We need to use new technologies to make sure that our transportation systems have a lower carbon footprint, and that's kind of a guiding principle in everything that we should do. So how do we innovate, though? So this is where a different type of mindset, I would say, is taking over, which is the entrepreneurial startup mindset. You can see all over the world, whether it's in the European marketplace, in the American marketplace, or the Asian marketplace, where startups, where small businesses are coming up with ways to disrupt the way business is done. And so this is where new technologies can be born in a very efficient manner with a sort of team of very collaborative younger engineers and scientists and computer scientists to be able to generate these two technologies. And the way these startups operate is they do a lot to develop new technology and prototyping, whether it's by 3D printing, building it all in-house. And for an example, my first job in the private sector was actually working at a Hyperloop technology company as an executive, where we built a Hyperloop. And so what we did was we took our money that we were able to raise from the venture capital community, and we built a half-kilometer-long Hyperloop in the desert in Nevada. There's no better way to demonstrate a new technology, a new transportation system, than actually building the system and showing to the community that it works. Eventually, you can scale it up and implement it somewhere else in the world, and hopefully across the world. Now, the other thing to realize, though, is that you don't want to reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. And so you can find other technologies which are being developed in other sectors which are synergistic with what you want to do in a disruptive sector. An example of that would be the automotive sector. The automotive sector is largely shifting over to autonomous driving right now, which means that they're developing software capabilities, they're developing diagnostic capabilities, which can be used by other transportation sectors. So if somebody else has already paid for the development cost, with the automotive sector, for example, you could leverage those technologies and implement it into a Hyperloop system, or what I'll talk about next, which is urban aerial transport. And so I go back to the vision of science fiction. This is a 1960s era cartoon, science fiction cartoon called The Jetsons, and it covered the modern life of people living hundreds and hundreds of years from now. And something which is always in the realm of science fiction is urban aerial transport. Sometimes people call it flying cars, or you can call it air taxis. And this is something that we would like to have become a reality in the next 2 to 5 years, which is the focus of what my company is that I founded. So I'll show you a video quickly. So our technology solution to the problem of traffic congestion is to create highways in the sky, to use electric airplanes which have the ability to take off and land vertically, so they can land in parking lots, on the top of rooftops, or in smaller general aviation airports. And so this technology is called eVTOL. There are many different companies who are developing different varieties of this type of aircraft. There's actually 2 in Germany that I'm aware of. There's several in the United States. But it's a brand new way of thinking about air travel. And our particular technology solution is using a tilt wing, which means that when the wing is tilted in the configuration you can see in this image, it has the ability to take off and land vertically, but then the wing returns to sort of a traditional fixed-wing aircraft flight, and it does the majority of its cruise like any other aircraft you might fly for commercial purposes. And so it's a new technology solution that doesn't exist yet, much we're building at my company. So the advantage of urban aerial transport is that you have the ability to go basically 5 times faster than you would on the roads, which ultimately reduces your trip time. You no longer are constrained to the 2 dimensions of space on the ground. You're now unconstrained to the dimensions of 3 dimensions in the air, as you can have highways in the sky. And because you're using an aerial mission profile, which doesn't really have to be any more than 25 miles per trip, you can have an aircraft which is fully electric, which eliminates carbon emissions from aviation. So this is a way to implement sustainable aviation very quickly in urban, suburban scenarios. Now, from the infrastructure side of things, and if there's anybody in the room who has a background in infrastructure, infrastructure is very expensive. Whether that's building railroads, roads, or bridges, there's a huge cost per kilometer for infrastructure. So what's nice about an urban aerial transport network is because the aircraft have the ability to take off and land vertically, you don't have to have large runways. You can use existing general aviation airports, which are all over the place, especially in the United States. There's probably about 5 GA airports in the vicinity of every major hub. So there is already an infrastructure that can couple to this new technology. In terms of what we're proposing, these vehicles are a shared ride service. They're part of the mobility as a service platform, which means that you would share it with other people, like an Uber ride. So we're designing a vehicle which can handle 4 passengers and 1 safety pilot, and has the ability to do 100 miles on a single charge, or multiple shorter journeys that cover 100 miles in duration. You can imagine scenarios where you're using it for a medical evac that you would do with traditional rotorcraft, as well as just for urban aerial transport scenarios. Now, the key to every new technology development is to do prototype demonstrations as quickly as you can. We've built a total of 6 aircraft to date to develop sort of the aerodynamic performance, the power usage profiles, to refine the vehicles so we can build a large one in future. And here's a video of the flight of one of our Subscale aircraft. So our company is actually located at an airport in the vicinity of Detroit. We're using the automotive industrial base to be able to create these aircraft. And so you can see here it flying in its transition from vertical mode to fixed wing mode and coming into land. So it's pretty straightforward. So this kind of software control is done autonomously. So already you can demonstrate from the get-go that these kinds of systems can be implemented at an airport, which is where we're located. So the good news is that many people have asked me over the course of this conference that, well, don't you have to worry about the regulatory space? How does this get updated? The good news is that there are many players in this field, including the large aerospace players, which means the government is already getting involved. And every year we actually have a summit, which Uber puts on, the same Uber that we drive around in now for shared ride on the ground, because they're interested in providing a software platform that couples to the technologies that several companies are building, including ourselves. And our next summit is actually next month out in Washington, D.C. So what would this look like in terms of the interior cabin? I think that's always important to put into perspective. Our vehicle is called Mobi 1 for Mobility 1. So you can see a safety pilot in the front seat, and then 4 seats in the back for passengers. So the other really interesting feature of using this technology is that by using electric motors, you cut down on noise pollution, and by using smaller, multiple rotors, you cut down on sort of the noise pollution which comes from the rotation of the blades. So that actually solves the problem of helicopters, which happen to be very noisy. So you get the idea of what the interior of the cabin looks like. So ultimately, in order to be able to implement this network across the world or across any kind of urban environment, is you have to make the cost affordable. Traditional rotorcraft, such as helicopters, are very expensive. So if you can come up with a vehicle technology which costs roughly the price of a very expensive sport utility vehicle, all of a sudden you can reduce the cost to what a traditional Uber ride is. And so our vehicle solution is trying to couple to sort of an expensive Uber ride between here and the airport, but 5 times faster. So you'll probably be willing to pay for it. So what do we want to do moving forward? We want to be able to create new transportation solutions which are green and even potentially energy positive. So an example that I'll show here of using a Hyperloop system, for example, you could put solar panels on the exterior of a Hyperloop tube to create energy which powers the local grid, including this transportation system. So as we implement everything moving forward, we want to do what we can to be as sustainable as we can, and ultimately provide mobility services to connect the planet in a green way. So to conclude the talk, I want to talk a little bit about what comes next, because this is in the news quite a bit, which is, well, what happens after we've solved all the ground-based transit? Where are we going to next? The interesting is the private sector is already looking at this. So in the United States, there are privately funded aerospace companies who are developing basically suborbital travel for space tourism purposes, potentially for transportation purposes in a rapid sense. So an example here would be Jeff Bezos, who's the owner, CEO of Amazon, has his own launch vehicle company, and the right-hand side is Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic vehicle. Both of these will probably be ready to carry people within the next 6 months to 18 months. So even closer for Richard Branson, because they've already done test flights, a little bit further off for Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin vehicle. So after that, what we would think about next is that what if we want to go to low Earth orbit and then beyond low Earth orbit? There are also vehicles under development for that sector as well. The image on the left is actually a government-funded vehicle development called the Orion capsule, which is intended to carry astronauts out to the moon, back to Earth, out to Mars, back to Earth, out to the main asteroid belt, back to Earth. And the vehicle on the right is purely privately funded, which is the SpaceX Dragon capsule, which is funded by Elon Musk's SpaceX company, and that is intended to carry people to the International Space Station for now, and eventually for different mission scenarios. So in the private sector, the technologies to send people into deep space are already rapidly under development, funded by private capital, which is kind of a fascinating thing. And so what does that couple to in the end is hopefully eventually getting people off of Earth. And the debate that's going on right now, at least in the US space program, is do we send people to the moon or do we send people to Mars? I'm personally a fan of sending people to Mars because I have my reasons for it. But from a technology development perspective, I think it makes more sense to send people to Mars because you get only, it's a zero-sum game. So if you're going to develop money on technology, you probably want it to be focused on one location. And so the good news is that on the robotic space program, which is where I spent most of my career, a lot of these technologies have been developed to send smaller payloads, and those can be scaled up to eventually send people there. And in the future, what that means is humans living on the surface of Mars in colonies, and the way this is a really nice way to tie this off is that in order for human beings to be able to survive on the space station or on the surface of another planet, they have to be green. They have to have no waste. They have to reutilize everything, including their own waste products from their bodies, to be able to survive. So if we can perfect being green and recycling here on Earth, then eventually we'll be able to survive and send people to live on the surface of Mars. So I think I only have 1 minute left, so I guess I take questions for the rest of it. Thanks.